So I just recently got an email from this right-wing political activist group, and they were telling me to come on out to a conference and they'll talk about the culture wars. They'll show me how to win the culture war that I exist in today. And I saw that, and I don't think you can lay the guilt of that purely on that institution, because I think it's indicative of where our political landscape is right now. No longer do we see politics as disagreement, as a process by which we can find solutions to complicated and nuanced problems. Politics has been reduced to tribal instinct, a zero-sum game between our side and the other. But it is in this environment that we have forgotten the necessity of both sides. The right needs the left just as much as the left needs the right. So today I want to make the case to you why the left is important. In other content, in other settings, we can discuss the necessity of the conservative movement, of why you need people on the right to defend the hierarchical structure of your society. But it is here in this time that I want to explain the other side, why the left is so important. But to do that effectively, what I want to do is start by taking a step back, by looking to figure out how we got here in this cultural position where politics is nothing but a tribal warfare. And I think it is from that point that we can launch into a discussion to truly understand why the left matters. Now beginning, it's important to understand the necessity for culture. Humans were these peculiar animals. You see, we're the only social being that binds itself together not by kinship. You think about all of us in this room, for instance, right? We're not biologically related as far as we can tell, but we're bound together. Why? By shared beliefs. But then you can think about the absolute miracle that it is that you can pull off a society with so many different people that have never even met one another. There is a real miracle in sociology to how large-scale society exists. And the reason and the way that humans are able to do that, it's through myth. David Bell is a sociologist of the post-industrial era, and he defines culture in part as being the human attempt to give a coherent set of answers to the existential situations that confront us all. Think about that for just a moment. Culture, it's the human attempt to present a coherent set of answers to the existential situations that confront all humans. Now, this isn't just what culture is, but it's a large part of it. So what has it been for America? What has it been for the West? What has been the coherent set of answers which define our social relations? Christianity. You see, at about 500 AD, the Roman Empire collapsed and Europe goes into the Dark Ages. But what was it in that time that acted as a centripetal force, that provided Europe the order by which Rome could become and transform into Europe? It was the church. The church is what grounded European identity, European institutions. And today, this is what Charles Taylor understands. Today, we are running off the fumes of Christian institutions. You see, Luther, in the Protestant Reformation, he stands before the Holy Roman Emperor, and he says, "Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God." And there's a lot of truth and good that came out of the Protestant Reformation, but one of the effects was you start to question the mythological basis for Christendom, for Western civilization. And out of that, you got 200 years of religious wars, brutally tarnishing the conscience and mind of Europe. So in about the 18th century, you get the Enlightenment. The European Enlightenment, it was an attempt to move away from this dogma, to domesticate the religious tempers of man. Man could cultivate his own garden and not get lost in religious dogma, not be held down by the orthodoxy of the cross. But what the Enlightenment project did was it delegitimized the myth. It upended our culture. It said no longer can you believe in the coherent set of answers which confront each and every one of us. It said no longer can you believe in Christianity. But Nietzsche, he understood the magnitude of what this meant. In his short story of The Madman, this man, he walks into a town and he says, "Where is God?" And everyone starts laughing at him and he says, "Listen, God is dead. And because God is dead, is the earth not unchained from the sun? Do we not know if we're going up, down, left, or right?" What Nietzsche understood is that all of Western morality All of our beliefs in politics or ethics, it's predicated upon the belief in a risen Christ. But when you no longer believe in that, you don't get to keep the morality on top. So what does this mean for the 21st century observant of politics? It's what Alistair McIntyre noted, and that there was no longer a common wellspring of moral knowledge for us to draw from. We can no longer start from the same presuppositions because we no longer believe in that moral basis. So what we're left with is warring tribes, fragmented political identities that have no deeper basis to appeal to. And this conceptual divide, it's actually taken on geographical significance in what we now refer to as the density divide. We've seen the formation of two Americas. The density divide, it's in reference to urban areas which are more densely populated are becoming overwhelmingly liberal, while rural areas are becoming much more conservative. Now, one thing we've known from sociology is this has always been a part of human society. Cities always congregate more, embrace more progressive ideas, while rural areas with stronger social capital keep with the tradition. For instance, we've seen this in the French Revolution, when a lot of these new revolutionary ideas, they were taking hold in Paris. But all throughout the French Revolution, they were fighting counter-revolutions in rural areas because there was a staunch divide between the rural and the urban. And what's interesting is de Tocqueville, he actually came to America in the mid-19th century off the heels of the French Revolution. And he's coming to see the stability of American democracy juxtaposed with that in Europe. And one thing he comments in America is the spirit of association. Americans were extraordinarily good at, for what he could tell, at being geographically integrated. There was a vibrant civic ecosystem that Americans took part in. And why does that matter? Because democracy needs face-to-face interaction. It's easy to hate a group that you don't interact with, but by individual face-to-face interactions, you lubricate social relations as to make it hard to abstract and hate another group. But in the late 20th century, things began to change. Robert Putnam writes this great work of political science called Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revitalization of American Communities. And he takes de Tocqueville's insight of the spirit of association, and he notes how America has lost it. He says through a complex process that's not worth getting into right now, the ecosystem which Americans were able to take part in at one point has been lost. And the important insight from this is that we've lost the moral framework as we touched about, but we've lost the geographical integration that made social relations possible. So how then are we communicating? How then are we talking about politics? Through technology. And this is a new field. It's the modern Gutenberg revolution. And we really don't have the evidence nor the understanding yet to comprehend the full magnitude of what this means. But Pew's been tracking political polarization in America since about Vietnam. And one thing they've been charting is political consistency, ideological consistency. And their findings are very revealing for our discussion at hand. You see, what Pew discovered is that following about Vietnam, if you asked Americans their issue on, say, one of 10 important political issues, you had about a 10% chance of being able to predict their views on the rest of them. Meaning people weren't ideologically converse, which makes sense. I mean, just think about it for a moment. Why should your belief on guns dictate your beliefs on the climate? Well, on its face, it doesn't make much sense unless politics has become tribal. Again, they checked back up with a similar study in 2004 and found a slight increase. But it's in 2014 that we see it double. And this can't wholly be ascribed to technology. Political polarization, as we've just discussed, has multiple trends. But the movement onto an online digital forum has made it so that people are less concerned with nuance and complexity, but 120-character ideological attacks. Our political dialogue has been symbolic, reduced to slogans, not the project of solving problems. So the run-through of this analysis, the point of this discussion thus far, has been to show how we've gotten to this point where we're engaging with politics in entrenched ideological camps. First, you have an incoherent moral framework for people to work out of. Second, you have geographical disunity, so people aren't embracing and integrating with those from the other side. And finally, you have the switch onto technology, which only has an incentive structure to increase hate. But as I promised you from the outset, what I want to do is explain why both sides are necessary, specifically why the left is important. Now, when we talk about the left and the right, these terms, they're a derivative of the 1789 French Assembly. People gathered at Versailles and they questioned those on the right were those who wanted to stick with the Ancien regime. Those on the left were those who wanted revolution. And that conceptual divide, it's been imprinted upon the Western political conscience since then. Bertrand Russell, he writes a history of Western philosophy, and he says, you run the clock all the way back to 600 BC, and what will you find? You'll find a party that stands for order and stability, the right, and you'll find a party that calls for change. And even in states like Israel or France that have multiple parties beyond two, you see the same phenomena, the same dichotomy that you can track. And this is what led John Stuart Mill in the 19th century to go, for a vibrant political system to exist, you need both the right and the left. And Jonathan Haidt, continuing with his analysis, what he points out, and he makes the argument for, is that there's actually a biological basis for this. And the reason I want to follow this argument down is because what I'm trying to explain is the utter significance of the left wing. It has a biological basis in humanity, and that means you can't just do away with them. You can't just win the culture war and get rid of the problems in your nation. No, you need the left wing just as much as you need the right. In the 1970s, there was a biologist by the name of Paul Rosen, and he dubbed what he called the omnivore's dilemma. Humans were omnivores, and that greatly increased our chance of survival. And this is also, humans, it's going to be actually very hard for us to go extinct because we can survive in just about any climate because we can eat anything from meat to vegetables. We're one of the few creatures with that capacity. And because we are omnivores, there's two biological hard drives that exist in us. We are paradoxically and at the same time neophiliac and neophobiac. The neophiliac side of us is that which is open to new things, that sees the requirement for us to move and go experience the new domain. Right? Imagine the early humans. When they're venturing into a new land, there's a part of them that said, maybe we can try this food. Maybe we can eat this. But there's another hard drive within there. And that's the neophobic, that which is afraid of new experiences. That says, wait a minute, you might not want to go travel into that new land because you don't know what's over there. And Jonathan Haidt in his research has found that conservatives score way more high on being neophobic, and liberals temperamentally score way more high on being neophiliac. They recognize the need to go see new experiences. And you could think about how we talk about sexual politics, right? The liberal cases open it up to the new ethic of the sexual revolution. And the conservative case is, wait a minute, you don't know what that's going to do to society. But the thing that we have to bear in mind is these at the same time are always a part of us. Now, Jordan Peterson, he's taken this analysis and almost made it into a metaphysics, a kind of dualism that resembles Eastern philosophy between order and chaos. That conservatives stand for order that is almost fundamental to being, and that liberals kind of reflects the opposite, the chaos, like you can think about it in the yin-yang. I don't think we have to go as far as that to still hold on to the significance of the left wing and see that it has deep roots in the human biological system. But it's important to note how deep this divide runs. The embrace of order, the necessity of chaos, both of which are fundamental to being. And the left and the right both have a role to play in that mediation of the two. But when we specifically look at the left, I want to talk about what the left-wing insight is, if both of them are simultaneously correct. I think the first one is the first and perhaps the most fundamental area of progressive wisdom is that to live in time is to change. Though man's nature might be fixed, humans throughout their history have existed in different anthropological eras. Think about it in your own life. I mean, you're not the same person you were yesterday. Thank God you aren't the same person you were 2 years ago or 3 years ago. You change, you update with the time. And the progressive understanding seems to be, listen, yes, the past, it might be important, but we ought to update our systems. And I think the problem is in the conservative analysis of revolutions, we always point to the flaws of Robespierre, the horror of Lenin. And don't get me wrong, that is apparent in the historical record. But what we forget is the damage done by the Ancien regime prior to the French Revolution. The past which these people were living in was tyrannical and barbaric. So they sought to progress. They sought to update their system. And this is true even in today. And it's important to note, as I pointed out, that these are both simultaneously correct. Think about America. America has a strong, rich historical tradition of Western civilization. And at the same time, the past is something that we should hold on to, but also move on from. Now, the progressive error seems to be in thinking the past is something you could just do away with, but nonetheless, the past is something that we need to evolve from beyond. The second one, I think, is the understanding of the damage of inequality. Will and Ariel Durant, they were these historians, and in their work, The Lessons of History, they talk about how inequality is something innate to humanity. God seems to distribute talents among a steep basis, and they have this line where they're talking all about inequality, how it's existed in different societies, and they say that when you look at the inequality in this world, it's enough to make you believe in Calvin's God. And all they mean by that is the damage and the strength of inequality. Think about it in your own life. You're surrounded by people at any given moment who are more talented than you, smarter than you, better looking than you, can do everything you can do better. And there's a certain pain that's made up in that. And I think the left-wing conscience is acutely aware of the dangers of inequality, of that state of suffering. And someone who tracked this well was George Orwell. We understand George Orwell to be a socialist. And he writes this book, Road to Wigan's Pier, when he travels out to this poor mining village in the backwash of England. And there he documents the story of the poor. He goes and he finds these people who have to crawl 5 miles to work every single day, who get rid of all of their teeth because they don't have the medical ability to pay for it. People, they live till 40 and die from the soot that builds up in their lungs. Orwell, he understood the dangers of inequality. And in America, we've seen the return of rampant income inequality. This is the highest levels it's been since 1928. I mean, the average CEO of today, he's making 380 times as much as the average worker. And on its face, these facts might not be bad. And the conservative answer is correct. Yes, but there's mobility. Yes, but some of it might be justified, and fair enough. But at the end of the day, we can't just skim over income inequality. Because I think one thing that the leftist conscience understands is that the working class upholds the system. The men and women who lay brick, that is what is, on some level, the cornerstone of any given civilization. Now, I think the Marxist error is his theory of labor, which reduces all work to labor, manual physical labor, and he does away with any management or CEO, and that's a fault. But there's an understanding for the inequality that capitalism could exacerbate, and I think that's correct. But for instance, there's this common analysis done with revolutions, especially in conservative circles, about the dangers that came with the Ancien regime. Right? We hear that the success of the American Revolution, it was because of humility. It was because they had God to temper the flames of their pride. I think that's true on some level, but one thing Hannah Arendt points out in her work on revolution is that America never had the income inequality problem that France did, that China did, that Russia did. You see, once you add the overlay of income inequality, it becomes more violent. This is the social implication of why income inequality is so important to solve. And I think Francis Fukuyama, he gets to the bottom of it. He points out that, listen, society on some level, it runs on the currency of honor and dignity. Money just stamps over that. We don't actually care about money for its own sake often. It's because if you have a lot of money, it's to articulate in a sense that society cares about what you're doing. You see, there's this deep-seated nature to inequality that the left is adequately tuned into. And the final point is the left is important to temper the flames of the right. Both of them do the same for the other. When we go back to the omnivore's dilemma, you need both sides. You need both of those biological hard drives. But right now, in the geopolitical landscape, we're seeing the return of right-wing populism. In Brazil, Poland, Hungary, Turkey, even in America with the election of Donald Trump, what we've seen is right-wing nationalism on the rise. And this can be used for good. Donald Trump has helped reveal and shake up the dust and show how middle America has been disenfranchised by a globalized economy. But you still need the left to point out the dangers inherent in that, just as much as you need the right to point out the dangers of the left. So what I ask in our political scene is, rather than trying to win culture wars, Rather than seeing politics as the manifestation of your own will to power, hold truth in tension. When we understand the Bible, part of the problem with systematic theology is it's an attempt to make sense of the complexity of the Bible. So it's easy to reduce it to a Lutheran interpretation, a Calvinist interpretation, whatever it might be. But I would encourage us to embrace the complexity in politics, to embrace the tension that both the right and the left can simultaneously be correct. We don't have to give up or abandon the existence of absolute truth, but we should abandon the ideological partisan divide which threatens to rip our social fabric. Thank you.